They didn't hang him. They gave him a choice. On October 14, 1944, one of Nazi Germany's most famous generals sat quietly in his home, knowing the war was already lost and that his own life was about to end. Erwin Rommel had once been a hero, the Desert Fox, a commander respected not just in Germany, but even by his enemies. But by the final year of the war, that reputation had become a threat. Because Rommel had started to doubt Hitler. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough to be noticed. The failed assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, known as the July 20 plot, shook the Nazi regime to its core. Officers, politicians, and insiders had tried to kill Adolf Hitler and end the war. They failed, and Hitler wanted revenge. The investigation that followed wasn't about justice, it was about fear. Names were extracted, connections were stretched. Anyone even loosely tied to dissent was suddenly dangerous. Rommel's name appeared, not as a direct conspirator, but as something worse in Hitler's eyes, a symbol. Rommel had reportedly supported the idea of negotiating peace with the Allies. He believed Germany was heading toward total destruction, and he was right. But in Nazi Germany, being right didn't matter. Loyalty did, and Rommel's loyalty was now in question. So the regime faced a problem. They couldn't publicly execute him. Rommel was too popular, too respected. Killing him outright could damage morale and expose cracks in the regime. So they designed something quieter, something controlled. Two generals arrived at Rommel's home that day. They didn't storm in, they didn't shout. They sat with him, calm, formal, final. They told him the truth. He had been accused of involvement in the plot against Hitler. There would be no trial, no defense, only two options. First option, face a public trial, be humiliated, found guilty, executed, and his family, his wife, his son, would likely be arrested, punished, possibly killed. Second option, take poison, die quietly, be honored as a hero, and his family would be left unharmed. It wasn't really a choice. Rommel understood that immediately. He asked for a moment. He went inside, spoke to his wife, Lucy, spoke to his son, Manfred. He didn't tell them everything. He didn't need to. They already knew. This wasn't a discussion. It was a goodbye. Rommel walked out in full uniform, calm, composed, almost peaceful. He got into the car with the generals. Minutes later, he was dead. Officially, the story given to the German public was different. Rommel had died from wounds sustained earlier in the war. He was given a state funeral, honored, celebrated, used. The regime protected its image, but behind that image was a quiet, controlled execution. And his family lived on. That was the deal. Manfred Rommel was only a teenager when his father died. He knew the truth, but for years he couldn't speak it. Because after the war ended in 1945, Germany didn't just rebuild physically, it rebuilt its memory. And Rommel became a complicated figure. To some, he was a brilliant military mind who had tried to step away from Hitler's madness. To others, he was still part of the machine that caused unimaginable destruction. For his family, it wasn't political, it was personal. Manfred grew up carrying a name that meant everything and nothing at the same time. He wasn't allowed to be just a normal man. He was always Rommel's son, always connected to a past he didn't choose. And yet, he didn't run from it. He faced it. Years later, Manfred Rommel became the mayor of Stuttgart. Not a soldier, not a general, a public servant. And in a country trying to come to terms with its darkest history, that mattered. He worked to rebuild trust, to reconnect Germany with the world it had tried to destroy. In a strange way, the son spent his life doing the opposite of the war his father had fought in. Not through denial, but through acceptance, acknowledging what happened and choosing something different. Rommel's wife, Lucy, lived a quieter life after the war. She carried the memory of that day, the silence, the car, the moment her husband walked away knowing he would not return. There were no dramatic last words recorded, no grand speeches, just a man making a decision under pressure no one should ever face.
Protect your honor or protect your family? Rommel chose his family. That's what history often forgets. It reduces people to roles: general, hero, traitor. But in that final moment, Rommel wasn't any of those things. He was a father, a husband, and he made a decision based on that. After the war, as more documents surfaced and the truth came out, the official story collapsed. The narrative shifted. People began to see what had really happened. Not a heroic death in battle, but a forced suicide, a controlled removal, a warning to others, and a final act of a regime trying to maintain power even as it was falling apart. Because by late 1944, Nazi Germany was already losing. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviet Union was crushing from the east. Berlin would fall within months. Hitler's empire was collapsing. But even in collapse, it demanded loyalty, absolute loyalty. Rommel's death wasn't about the July 20 plot anymore. It was about control. It was about sending a message. No one was untouchable, not even the desert fox. And yet, in trying to silence him, the regime created something else, a story that would outlive it. Because today, when people look back at World War II, they don't just see battles and maps. They see choices, moral lines, moments where individuals had to decide what mattered most. Rommel's final decision sits in that space. Not clean, not simple, but human. His family survived the war. That was the promise. And for them, survival wasn't just physical. It was living with the truth, living with the legacy, and deciding what to do with it. Because history doesn't end when the war ends. It continues in the lives of those left behind, in the children, in the silence, in the stories that are finally told years later. Rommel's story didn't end in that car. It continued through his son, through a country rebuilding itself, through a world trying to understand how something so catastrophic could happen. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the poison, not the funeral, but the quiet, uncomfortable truth that even in one of the darkest regimes in history, the final act of one of its most famous generals was not about power, but about protecting the people he loved.